Hello all, welcome to the March meeting of the ACT-IAC IT MMI COI meeting. Very happy today to have some very special guest speakers. So we'll go ahead and get it kicked off. I'm going to first turn it over to Vera for introductions.
All right, thank you. And I'm so glad to be co-moderating with Melvin, which we haven't done in a while. I'm here on my personal capacity. And this topic is something that we're all very passionate about, organizational change management. I think March is a great time to be talking about it. You know, one day you're walking out and there's beautiful daffodils and the next day there's snow on top of them. But anyway, we have been talking about this across the board in industry, and also those of us on the ACT-IAC Executive Committee are also very focused on this. The folks that are here on our panelist list have all probably, I think I can safely say all of us have built systems that would now be considered legacy, and most of us have modernized systems and or doing that at the same time. And so with that, I'm going to pitch it over to Melvin for more formal introductions and to ask the first question.
Thanks, Vera. Yeah, the subject of change management and organizational change management is not a new subject. And as Vera so eloquently put it, we've all had some passions around this. While I'm in this session, I may be joined by my dog in the background, so I'm going to be having some fun with that. So welcome to virtual work from home. So I want to take a moment, as you can see on the screen, who our colleagues are, but I want to start with Beth, who is the acting deputy CIO. She is the deputy CIO, rather, at GSA. And Beth, I want to start with you, but let's talk about this common confusion that goes on with change management. You know, a lot of people think it's the configuration management or configuration control. And so can you talk about the distinctions between culture and the need to get stakeholders on board, and just talk about, you know, change management as a whole? What is it?
Yeah, so I agree that there is a lot of confusion. When you say the term change management, everybody understands what it is, and it's very different things. So if you're in a technology world, change management and configuration management is all around getting approval of a change of a system and tracking the changes of a particular component of that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about organizational change. That means that we need to communicate with our stakeholders, a whole 360, above, below, sideways. We need to make sure that they're trained, that we talk to them about what their actual needs are, to show them prototypes, to be in an agile environment and having iterative design reviews so they can see what's actually coming, to do training, to be able to communicate, because that back and forth communication is what's going to make whatever you're implementing from a technology perspective successful. I think myself and some of the colleagues that are on the phone have some horror stories of times when communication failed the program. It wasn't the technology was ready, but when you actually didn't communicate, you know, that then put the kibosh on what was going to happen, because those particular stakeholders were not engaged, they were not supportive, and they would not allow it to be in place. Or if it did go into place, it never got used. Right. So the communication aspect of this and how fast the culture in your organization can take the change. Because then sometimes, you know, we're all ready to go from a technology perspective, but the culture isn't. And if you push too hard, too fast, you bump up to that resistance. So you really need to understand your stakeholder community all the way across, be able to understand what you need to do from a communication perspective, understand that velocity by which change is there, and helping them prepare for the change. Because from a technology perspective, you might think, well, I'm just moving, you know, things from this side of the screen to the other side of the screen. But what you don't know is that change is completely their business process, right? And so if they haven't prepared for how that business process is going to be impacted, or have some really big issue with changing that business process, whether it's just the way they've always done it and they're just really nervous and risk avoidant, to there's some statutory reason they have to do it that way. Okay, so you really need to make sure that you're understanding the totality of what you're going to put this capability into. And that's what we talk about when we say organizational change management.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Beth. So Steve, we're going to ask you the second question. And Steve and I have been talking about putting something together and starting this since we were on opposite sides. So with procurement sensitivities, we couldn't. And so I'm really excited to talk about it. And I think what Beth talked about tees up really nicely to what we want to do to address. We're all familiar with that people, process, and technology. And we're really talking about that people component because we know the best technology and solution isn't going to work if the people don't accept it. And, you know, the importance of all of that. So can you tell us a little bit, we all learn our lessons the hard way, right? About the importance of engaging and making sure you're engaging all the stakeholders. I think you have a great experience from your time at IRS, I believe.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks, Vera. And this really will build on what Beth talked about. It's not quite a horror story because it actually ends up with a good ending, but there's definitely a lesson learned. So this, you know, talking about the IRS this time of year is almost always timely because we were all probably working on our taxes. Hopefully everybody's e-filing, and that's really what the story is about. Back in 1998, the IRS had a big push to shift from paper to electronic filing. Part of the push came from Congress because they actually gave the IRS a legislative target of 80% e-filing. And at the time the legislation was passed, it was at about a 20%. The team I was working with at the time knew that there were a number of things that we had to do to hit that legislatively mandated target. And it was a combination of articulating a vision for what e-filing was going to do, not only for our stakeholders, but internally in the IRS. And to some extent, part of what we had to do was create a group that was dedicated to e-filing. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that group. We had great support from the commissioner. We actually had pretty good support from industry as well, because we'd really been cultivating them. So we kind of laid the groundwork for that. And so that was an example of the stakeholders I think that Beth talked about. We had to do some innovative things. One of the things that we did at the time, which I think we take for granted for now, was we actually started a marketing campaign. We eliminated paper signatures, and for the purposes of this story, we enabled electronic payments, which had not been possible until that time, and in particular, credit card payments. Congress actually authorized credit card payments as part of a piece of legislation in 1998. And I still remember the headline at the time in USA Today, which said, even though IRS has the authority to issue credit cards, it'll never happen. And despite that headline, in about a year, our team actually got it done. And you can imagine, one of the great things about the IRS, and I think Harrison will probably talk about this in a bit, is that they are so committed and so focused to making sure that the filing season happens on time and then it works well. So there's a lot of advanced planning that goes along with that. And in this case, it turned out there was one key stakeholder group that we forgot to talk about when we launched electronic payments in 1999. We had it all worked out with the credit card companies and with the electronic filing community. So think about, you know, H&R Block, Jackson Hewitt, Intuit. And they were all set and very excited because this was going to be a key feature that was going to help drive adoption of electronic filing. And about the time we turned it on, the middle of January, we started getting calls from frustrated tax preparers saying, my client's ready to file their return. They want to make a payment with their credit card, and they're being told by our IRS customer service that the IRS would not accept credit card payments. Well, that answer that the customer service folks gave had been right, literally for generations. And what we discovered the hard way was that the scripts for the customer service agents are typically done in the summer and the fall before filing seasons. So we had pulled it together so quickly that we just got it ready for in time for filing season. But in our rush to do that, we missed a key stakeholder group. We then had to scramble to make sure that we had updated scripts available for the customer service agents. And you can imagine the folks in the field weren't very happy with us because, you know, that was kind of egg on the face of the folks answering the phone and for the service. So the moral of the story, again, to go back, I think to what Beth talked about is, even though we thought we had done a good job of communicating and working with our stakeholders, it turned out we missed a key stakeholder group. The silver lining to all this is that, it ended up working successfully. I checked the stats last night, and right now, e-filing for IRS for individual taxpayers is up around 90%. So they actually exceeded the goal that was set by Congress, but it was definitely an important lesson learned in not forgetting a key stakeholder group.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I did want to remind folks that in the chat, you can post your questions. Melvin and I have a few we're teeing up, but we really want to hear from you. And Steve, as a taxpayer who files electronically, I want to say thank you.
There you go.
Over to you, Melvin, for the next question.
Yeah, so this is IRS season, and so Harrison gets to talk about how he's building on the work that Steve's done. So this transition is phenomenal. So Harrison, you've built a team, and you're trying to tackle modernizing and digitizing at IRS. You're trying to move people away from paper to electronic and digitization, a monumental task. And so what do you, building on the work that Steve and that team did and what you started, what are some of the strategies or tactics that you're using to, sort of make that shift? I mean, we're not talking about a speedboat turn. We're talking about a cruise ship, and you're trying to turn it. So what are some of your strategies on that?
Yeah, bank hard left, as they say. No, I think the piece here that's super important is my experience in procurement has really prepared me for a world without paper. That's a joke for any of you who have fun in the procurement arena. No, seriously, I think there's a huge portion of this is kind of what Beth started with, which is definitions and structure matter quite a bit, especially in not only identifying what the system can handle, but also to identify sort of safe spaces and structures where you can push in small steps and in known steps. So a lot of what we focused on in the first 18 months or so of the organization has been getting ourselves intertwined and supporting those structures that already exist, whether or not they're governance entities, whether or not they're advisory committees, whether or not they're offices, whether or not it's just defining terms, right? I mean, you can go into digitization versus digitalization versus digital transformation, and just as with change management, come up with many different perspectives and definitions, and so those are really important. So in that vein, we took very seriously the definition of two sets of terms. One was incremental, adjacent, and transformative, which we used to describe how complicated and how long it takes to perform certain sets of changes. So incremental is something that's very near term, something that doesn't have a lot of variables, something that we can control. I talked about procurement for a quick second earlier. What are the thresholds where we need to review contracts at a certain level, right? Does the chief procurement officer need to review everything at $50 million or $75 million? Well, who controls that? The chief procurement officer controls that, so that's an incremental change. It's very easy. Adjacent is using existing systems or existing processes in slightly different ways. And ultimately, transformative is fundamentally changing how we do things. Similarly, we looked at business processes, technology, and policy. Again, as both Steve and Beth have said before me, tech is rarely the issue, right? It's the people that it's involved, it's the business process that are involved, and it's the policies that are involved. And what we found pretty quickly was that there are frequently major changes that you can have without any new shiny objects, right? We achieved an 81% acceleration in throughput by using eFax. eFax is not a shiny new toy. That's been around for, I think it's like 28 years. It's been around for a very long time. But by being able to use that adjacent system to do different things is really, really important. And I think the danger of sort of structuring and defining things in particular ways is that there are some entities and some perspectives that will lead you to narrowing things down into, okay, so we can manage the change just in this very, very, very small area because that's where we're comfortable with, right? And you have to establish yourself frankly, as an individual and as an office and as a system of relationships so that you can press back a little bit harder on that at specific times. Because it's ironic, if there's a process in a system that is set up a certain way to approve certain types of requests, it will automatically reject something that is not familiar, something that is outside the norm, something that chooses a fundamentally different approach. And I think those are the areas where you've got to be careful, right? You can't be we joke, we got to watch out for the Kool-Aid man who's always busting through all the walls and making a huge mess. You can't do that all the time because people are going to get tired of it. The people doing it are going to get tired of it. And certainly the rooms that you're busting into and making a mess are also going to be very tired of you being there. So you've got to manage that pace of change. You've got to find ways to solve people's problems and do so with enough structure so that, for lack of a better phrase, you're not freaking everybody out. It's important to do that for everybody's well-being and the well-being of the project that you're trying to move along. Thanks.
Now you just put a visual in my head of hey Kool-Aid. So now I got this big cherry dude busting in through the walls. Yeah, great analogy, Harrison. Vera, over to you.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to be imagining that for a long time. I can see a lot of good memes for that. So good follow over to you, Beth. We've talked a little bit about what works, what doesn't, learning hard lessons, etc. Can you talk a little bit more about the keys to success, and in particular, the different approach you might have if you're coming in on the heels of a troubled or challenged modernization or starting fresh? Because it's really a bit of a different approach.
Yeah, so I can kind of tag on to what Steve was talking about, and I think there was a question in the chat about other examples. So before I was at GSA, I was at the Department of Health and Human Services, and I was hired immediately after something called the launch of Healthcare.gov. And for those of you who might not remember, this was the launch of what everybody coined as the Obamacare website to register for insurance that would be either supplemented or paid for by the government, depending on what your social economic status was. And coming in, they obviously had a major failure with that program. Again, didn't talk to all of their stakeholders. They actually had a number of hearings about the failure of that particular program at its launch. And so obviously they were looking for new people to come into the department at the time to shake things up and get everything fixed. And so coming into an organization that to this day is still an example of a bad program, the first thing that I did was listening. So I went on a major listening tour for 90 days. And I actually went, to executives, I went to peers, I went to people in the organization, I went to the staff, and I was trying to understand what from a governance and program perspective was working well and what wasn't. And one of the complexities that a lot of large departments have, including Treasury, IRS, HHS, is that they're very federated. Right, which means that in many cases, when you have these large programs, the responsibility of different parts of the program are actually done by different parts of the organization. And each part of the organization in this particular case was just chugging along, not really validating their requirements, but had requirements that they were chugging along too. And either did not touch base with the other side, so complete disconnect, or didn't have the stakeholders coming back in and doing that periodic review and check and saying, is this right? Is this right? And you saw what ended up happening. So as I was trying to put some things in place, that was the first thing I started with, which is, how do we bring this trust back? Because not only was there lack of trust with our stakeholders, there was lack of trust across the organization and a lot of finger pointing. And so really trying to rebuild those relationships is where you have to start, and getting back the brand recognition. It's easy to lose brand recognition in a matter of minutes or hours. It takes 5 times longer to build it back. Right? And so that's really what you somewhat have to focus on. And what does that mean? There's a lot of different tools in the toolbox for that. but it's a lot of individual conversations. It's a lot of, having the trust in the people that really have that responsibility, but having that continued engagement with them, not poking people with hot sticks, not, being negative towards them, not trying to cut them off, but having to engage them as a robust community, because it does take a village to actually be successful in these. It's different if you're starting from scratch, right? Which is, you're starting from scratch, there isn't an expectation except that you're going to be successful. So all you can do is potentially lose your credibility versus a failed program where that's already happened. So you're at the bottom in a failed program. You're at the height for a new program that doesn't have those expectations. And so you have to figure, okay, if everybody thinks that we're great, that we can do this, how do you continue to motivate your team? How do you motivate and engage those stakeholders to continue to be part of that along the way and not become disillusioned? How do you change your pace and velocity so that people are continuing to see progress? Big Bang doesn't work, for example, that they continue to see growth and progress and they're not waiting for something to be birthed 3 years later, right? Where they're like, okay, I'm just become disillusioned. So you want to make sure that you're providing that rigor so people can keep being very impassionate about this new thing you're building. So the skills and things that you're looking for to do there is engagement, but providing them little pieces and parts of a solution along the way so that they continue to have that excitement and build on success. The other part for a brand new program is you have the ability to focus on kind of pain points and the big picture, but you have to do that kind of in that agile methodology, which is how are you going to do your sprints to show some new work, but also fix some things along the way, including making sure that you have your cybersecurity, you're looking at your acquisition, because again, it takes the village in either case. But you want to, in the new solution, make sure that you're building on those successes so that you don't get to that failure stage.
That's great. Thank you. And I think the key word from my takeaway is whether you're coming in on a troubled or fresh, a key word is trust. Whether you're trying to regain trust or whether you're trying to earn trust that you're going to be able to deliver. But thanks so much for sharing those very important lessons learned and experiences. Over to you, Melvin.
The destinations of digital effort at the Department of Transportation was considered to be a monumental success. Steve, that happened to be your last job. And so kudos to you and the team. And so, what were your thoughts on that? What led to that success? What were some of the key drivers and what were some of the pitfalls, things that you would do differently if given the opportunity?
Right. Thanks. Thanks, Melvin. Well, I think Beth made an interesting point when she talked about the dynamic at HHS. And I think for most of the major cabinet agencies that I would almost call holding companies, there's a very similar dynamic. I mean, she talked about federated governance. And I think in the big departments like Treasury, HHS, Department of Agriculture, federated almost doesn't begin to describe the level of autonomy that the major program offices and business units have. And that was definitely the case at DOT. I think part of what helped at DOT was frankly FITARA. And the previous CIO before Destinations Digital, Richard McKinney, had a bit of an epiphany once FITARA was enacted. He said, and Richard has told the story hundreds of times. Anybody who's heard this has heard Richard tell the story. So, but it's an important preface to what led to Destinations Digital. And the epiphany that Richard had was, I'm now really responsible for all of cybersecurity and the whole network. And I'm not entirely sure I know how big it is or what it's connected to. And he actually did a commissioned a survey and discovered that because of the autonomy that the operating units within DOT had, that there were nodes on the network that they, in good faith, doing their mission work, had stood up, and that Richard and the CIO's office did not know about. And it led to a pretty significant reevaluation of how they were architecting the network and how they were controlling it. And a big part of that, as you can imagine, was essentially minimizing the attack surface from a cybersecurity perspective. And it started a whole conversation about shared services within the department. And then, the change to the administration came in, and Vicki Hildebrand came in as the new CIO, over 30 years of experience within Hewlett-Packard doing shared services. So when she arrived and we talked to her about, what she thought our risks were and what our priorities were, she said, it seems like Richard and you all really started down the shared services path. We have both responsibilities and authority under FITARA. What can we do to take those concepts and really turn it into a digital transformation program that goes beyond just dealing with the network, but really focuses on helping the operating units serve their customers and their stakeholders. And what Vicki then launched into it was probably a textbook case of somebody doing organizational change management, using one of the best known theories by a guy named Cotter, which is, he has an 8-step process for leading change, right? I think any of us who've been in an organizational change management class, gotten a ProSci certification, this is like the bedrock to most of that work. And Vicki didn't say she was doing that, but as I look back on the steps that we went through to get digital destinations digital launch, I realized that was the playbook that she was working from. So she created a sense of urgency, which is the first step. And part of that sense of urgency was, one, if we don't create destinations digital, carry it out, get a handle on our cyber, it's really going to it's going to threaten our ability to deliver services. So within DOT, think about this. One of the most public-facing services that we provide is making sure that buses and trucks are safe on the road. So when you see a DOT number on a vehicle, that's done by the motor carrier group within DOT. And they make sure that bad drivers are not on the road and safe vehicles are not on the road. So, any risk to those services has broad implications. Same with NHTSA. They're the people that track defects and do recalls. So, it's not, I think sometimes people forget about DOT safety missions. So she wanted to make sure that we were really supporting their efforts to support the safety mission. She built a guiding coalition. She worked tirelessly, starting with the secretary and deputy secretary, all the political heads of those operating units, to understand why destinations digital was important, why technology was important to fulfilling their mission. So when it came time to actually roll it out, it wasn't just the IT organization. She had the buy-in of the top political leadership within the organization. She clearly created a vision. I still remember the session where we actually came up with the logo Destinations Digital, and it was a thoughtful play on the mission of the department. The notion of a destination clearly was a future state. For those of us who've done strategy work or done architecture work, there's always that future state, and so that logo captured it. And with that vision, there were a set of key initiatives that she outlined that was going to take us from our current state to our future state. One of the things that Cotter talks about is the listing of volunteer army. So what we did that I thought was very helpful and impressive is classic, really strong stakeholder engagement. So we had a clear vision that was endorsed by the secretary, the deputy secretary, all the political leadership and the top career leadership. Then the question is, how do you enlist the next level down in the organization? We actually had a group of study teams that were made up of, GS 15s and 14s and staff level folks within each one of the operating units, led by our office. And we said, Vicki's given us this vision. How are we going to implement it? What are the barriers that we have to deal with? What are the things that we can build on that are already in place to make this successful. So that was her version of the volunteer army. She was dedicated to making sure that we remove barriers, which, you know, I think both Harrison and Beth have talked about. It's inevitable that when you start to have the Kool-Aid person crashing through the wall, that people are like, whoa, 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 I didn't ask for this. Why are you doing this? And so I think it was a way to make, and what happens, I think that the National Defense Mechanism is like, I'm sorry, but you're not following the rules. You haven't filed your paperwork. And so sometimes it's like, well, do we really need that paperwork? Is that really required by the rules? So I think we had to have those conversations about dealing with both real and perceived barriers. And again, that's a matter of stakeholder engagement. And I think the last thing that she did really well was we had to really celebrate successes. And I think this gets a little bit to the question that Val asked. We made a point to identify measurable goals, whether it was mission goals around cycle times and answering customer inquiries. Within the IT organization, we had to demonstrate that we were going to be nimble as a shared service provider and reduce cycle time for fulfilling customer service requests internally for IT. Did we get better coverage on our licenses when we engaged in category management? Did we get lower cost per unit when we went to market at scale to buy software or storage? So we made a point of having a very public communications mechanism around the brand and banner of Destinations Digital to prove that even though there was disruption that went along with the change, there were benefits to it and that we were able to build on that success and move things forward. So that was Destinations Digital. You're on mute.
Awesome. Melvin, you're on mute. That's okay.
How do you know I'm on mute?
Because I see your mouth moving and nothing's coming out. Oh,
Over to you.
thanks. That's great. And I have to say, at the time that came out, that was when I was on the industry side and transportation was a new customer we were trying to break into. And what I loved about all of that, it was all on one sheet of paper. It was really communicated in a way that anybody could understand, whether outside or inside. And inside, you could point to where you supported that initiative. So I think that was great. So Harrison, back in the old days, IT and IT modernization was really just about IT, but we've gotten smarter, right? And so we know we have to factor in things like budget, acquisition, and how do you make room for modernization when budgets are tight? Also, if you would like to maybe talk a little bit also from your hat on the TMF board and the importance of change management and what you're looking for there. But yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about how maybe at IRS you're making room for that modernization, in particular in your new organization?
Thanks, Vera. I think the point here is there's a lot to be said about communicating the structure and the pain points that both Steve and Beth Ann talked about. You know, there's sometimes a danger of having a system which functions in such a lean fashion that you can't have any transformative efforts. You can't truly modernize. You can maybe distill, you can tweak, you can shift and get a couple percentage points here or there. But if you're looking at a perspective around, you know, how do we fundamentally change how we do things? That's going to take time and resources and bandwidth. And if you're running super lean with all resources and all efforts accounted for in keeping the lights on, so to speak, you don't have the ability to shift, right? You don't have the ability to take on other activities. You know, that being said, you don't want to let the pendulum swing too far in that area, because then you've just got a whole lot of people talking about neat things and not necessarily supporting the near-term needs, you know, the filing season and the like. So it really is important to have that balance and to identify the types of things that you're trying to press on, that you're trying to modernize, and that you're trying to be transformative about. And I think that's one of the really neat things about the TMF is that the ability, as I think it was Melvin who talked about earlier, the ability of sometimes of federal agencies to bank hard left is limited. We're not necessarily a jet or an airplane, but maybe an aircraft carrier. because of the nature of the political cycle, because of the nature of legislation, because of the nature of the budget cycle, whatever it is. Don't always have the ability to say there's a really great opportunity to modernize or to do something transformative in the next 6, 12, 18 months. It's kind of like you have to plan 3 years out to be transformative, and who knows where we're going to be with that. So I think the perspective and the approach and the impetus and the concept of the Technology Modernization Fund is that's one of the reasons it's so important, right? It's able to supplement and really help drive and identify what might be possible, right? And I think one of the biggest areas that we get into conversations around, not talking about any one proposal or agency specifically, is the ability to come in with an idea of where you want to go. And I think it was Val, right, who was bringing up how do you manage those change? How do you do it in an incremental and continuous improvement process? You have to come in knowing that you're not going to do it right, or at least knowing that there's a way to improve. I find it really, really dangerous whenever somebody says, yep, I've got everything covered. Yes, I'm an expert. Because I feel like that's about the time where you know that there's a pretty big gap in experience and expectation. I think it was, I forget who it was that said the only thing that I know is that I don't know anything. That's super, super important to be able to come in with your eyes wide open and be able to shift and adjust as appropriate. I think the other point that you want to look at here is we've worked pretty hard within the Internal Revenue Service to address the pain points of we can't get a contract out quickly enough, we can't get a flexible enough contract out to do those kinds of things. With Pilot IRS, at least for the three challenge statements that we put out last year within enterprise digitalization, the average time from solicitation release to award was 32 calendar days. That's really fast. I think even knowing that it would require a different level of engagement, a different level of resources after award, we still weren't fully prepared for it. When you've got folks who are used to having quarterly updates or monthly deliverables or semi-annual meetings with the senior executives, all that shifting to, hey, can I talk to you in 2 hours? No, why don't you wait till our daily meeting, which is tomorrow, right? Those are fundamentally different conversations, and they require the government to be ready to not have everybody nose deep in the work they're doing on a day-to-day basis, right? It's this important part about how do we stop, how do we prioritize, and how do we make sure that we're really leveraging that existing bandwidth and resources, almost an inefficiency, if you want to look at it that way, to fundamentally improve how we move forward. So again, I think, that communication piece is super important. I think the ability to understand, hey, as soon as you think you've solved the problem, whether it be an acquisition or procurement or budget, another one's going to pop up, and you've got to be humble enough to understand that. And frankly, walk in the room saying that. Because if you've got enough time to perfect an approach, I'm telling you, tomorrow it's going to be more perfect. And the next day it's going to be more perfect. And you'll have a really, really good plan that has never actually stood the test of being implemented. It's a really important activity to be able to find that sweet spot of, I know enough, this is a manageable amount of risk, I can find out quickly enough whether or not it's going to work, and this is how I'm going to proceed going forward to continue to improve and move ahead and communicate those challenges and those expectations. I think that's really the sweet spot for all of us in the change management arena. Thanks.
That's great. And you raised so many great points there, but in particular around risk and risk tolerance. And I loved the build-in inefficiency so you can get to efficiency, if I can paraphrase that a little bit. I want to remind our participants, I know some of you have been posting some questions in there, but please, do use the chat to ask questions. And Melvin, I'm going to tee it over to you to get those questions rolling.
Yeah, thanks, Vera. So I'm laughing at Harrison about refining the process. And I'm reminded of the commercial of the parents that had more than one child. By the time you get to child number 5, it's what was important with child number 1 is just no longer important. You refine that process over time. So yeah, I'm familiar with that model. And so Harrison, I'm going to come back to you specifically around your procurement and acquisition knowledge. And from the government perspective, we've started to move in the agile way, which is great. And we see a lot of agile procurements. However, when customers or when contractors show up to deliver the work, we tend to fall back into the delivery of waterfall. And so what what do we do? What are some of your recommendations to help us to fully execute on that procurement in an agile way?
Well, that's a great question. I think the point is that you've got to do a lot of prep work. And one of the perspectives that I've seen be really, really helpful is even within the IRS, when we are super focused on improving the taxpayer experience and helping taxpayers get more information, there's stuff that we can do with publicly available information, right? There's an opportunity to look at even representative data to find out whether or not something works. Because I think there's a tendency at times to say, it takes me X amount of resources to get to the acquisition cycle. It takes me X amount of resources to get a budget. It takes me X amount of resources to get a PM or a level 3 core, or any of these things that, well, let's go for this big bang. Let's go for this thing that's really going to fundamentally change how we're going to do things. And my question whenever we talk about that is, how long is it going to take you to find out whether or not it works? Because I've got to go through a privacy and disclosure. I've got to go through security clearances. I've got to go through all these things for folks to get access to the information before they even start. So if you think you're going to have a deliverable in 2 to 3 weeks based on any type of sensitive information, I will respectfully but also politely laugh at you. Like, there's no way that's going to happen. It's just not going to happen. But if we start talking about representative data or publicly available data to test that use case and to get everybody a little bit more comfortable with the cadence, because we're not talking about taxpayer data, again, not talking about it. We're talking about stuff that's on irs.gov. Oh, that's already out there. That's already been proven. That's already been approved. That's been an area that I think is super, super important. So the types of information that folks start with, I think is really, really important and frankly, a fairly straightforward way for government agencies to manage the risk process accordingly. Then once you have folks who have gone through the clearance, once you've had the opportunity to look at their systems or whatever it is they're working on, then there's a little bit more comfort level there from the structural perspective. And plus you've already been doing the work with that team for the past however many months or weeks. So that's an area that I think is super, super important. Finding out the data that represents, or the use case that represents the least amount of risk and allows you to get started the fastest, and also allows you to find out whether or not it works before you expend that effort and that resource to get folks to access the more complicated or complex or risky areas. Thanks, Melvin.
No, thank you. Vera, over to you, ma'am.
All right. So Beth, this one's for you. The question was, how do you convince senior leaders about how to expand and support transformative change? And I'm going to twist it a little bit to, because I was also thinking about when you get your champions, you do need an executive at the top that is your champion. You also sometimes need that grassroots. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you get change at multiple layers and if one's more important than the other?
So, the way you get the buy-in from the top is you bribe them. No, I'm just kidding. So, I mean, the way you get the buy-in from the top is you show the business value, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the way that they're going to be bought into any big changes you're doing is to show how you're, making the mission more effective. You're solving problems for that customer, that you're, being able to do more with less. Whatever that business proposition is, taking technology and shifting it to that business value really helps. Because in many cases, you're going to find most of the executives and politicals in the agency are not CIOs or CTOs. Shocking as that might be. And being that the case is, a lot of the time that technologists come to them with a proposition, they're asking for a bunch of money and saying, trust me. And they don't know any of the things that you're talking about. You could be talking a completely different language to them. So the best thing for you to do is, as technologists, don't expect your senior leaders are going to shift their lexicon and their language to you. You need to shift your language to them. And for them, it's going to be in terms of business. The other thing that you might want to be able to talk to them about is not just business value, but mission risk, right? If we don't do these cyber things, the likelihood that they're going to steal all our data in some other country is X, Y, and Z. A lot of agencies will actually do that as part of their strategic planning, which is what's going to have the most business value, or what's going to reduce the most risk? And that's where they apply those dollars. And so that's the kind of lexicon you need to think to them. If you're trying to build support at the grassroots level, it's great to have a roadshow, right? Talk to them. But again, you need to tailor it to that customer. If I think about GSA, GSA has some very different missions. So we have the Public Building Service and the Federal Acquisition Service. If I go to the Public Building Service and tell them about how this would help them get more market value with acquisitions and build better government-wide vehicles, they're going to look at me like I have three heads. If I talk to them about how they're going to be able to better manage buildings, be able to reduce cost and operations, they're going to understand what I'm talking about. So again, you need to be able to tailor your message to the customer or the stakeholder in front of you. So it's good to have a communication playbook and understand what you're asking for. And again, the conversation with your CFO is going to be very different than the conversation with your CHICO, which is going to be a very different conversation than your Chief Acquisition Officer. So you need to be able to spin the message that's relevant to the community you're talking about. And then you're going to have those conversations. Just ask them point blank, okay, here's the proposal. What am I missing? Because the vantage point that you're sitting at has a particular view. The view that's up at the top is going to have a very different political view. The view at the bottom is going to have a very mission and customer view. And they're going to be closest to those particular visions. And you're somewhere probably in the middle. And so you need to be able to have those dynamic conversations, but you have to be able to start the conversation. And if I'm talking in a particular language and you're talking a different language, it's very different for us to communicate. So as technologists, we need to be, multilingual to be able to have those conversations. And if we can't, we've at least got to find someone that can be the translator for us. And so that's the best way to be effective, and to understand which populations and stakeholders will have those best viewpoints. Who is the best person to talk for the customer? Who is the best group to talk about the business? Who's the best to talk about the risk? Who do we need to talk to get money and get buy-in, right? And some of that is going to be sometimes outside of your organization, right? We still have to get money from Congress. Who's going to be that best advocate in your budget and talking to the Hill? You may have some risks. How do you talk to your auditors about how this is going to buy down the risk so you can get some of those advocates? Even industry in many cases can also be advocates, depending on how you bring them into those conversations. So don't be siloed in how you do those communications and do those stakeholders. But yes, in order to be successful, you've got to have the grassroots champions, what are going to be your change agents and help the change happen. And you're going to need that high executive sponsor as both, as we heard, which is kind of going to drive that change and challenge us to continue to push forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Beth. A lot to definitely, it's so funny because I feel like this is a topic I know a lot about, but every time I talk about it, I learn 10 new things. Harrison, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, and it's something that has been really the forefront of my mind as of late is Beth Ann's point about the importance of that communication, the importance of those slightly tweaked and different messages and different concerns that you're addressing. And at the same time, not letting it become a communications monster that eats your lunch, for lack of a better phrase. Right? I mean, it can turn into sort of taking over all your time, I find, and it kind of increases that communication need that has to be addressed, increases, I think, with the complexity and the breadth of the change that you're looking at. So in addition to trying to start as small as you possibly can, with as few variables as you can, one of the things that we're working on is how do we really generate opportunities to have a single set of information that translates well for everybody, right? So whether or not that's something as just as simple as here is our standard briefing deck for this activity. Here is a slick paper that anybody can read that's got the point of contact, that has the monthly standing meeting and who you want to get with, and what the goal is, and if there are industry partners involved, who those industry partners are. trying to be able to find the right way to balance that importance of tailoring the message, which Beth answered it much better than I can, of tailoring that message to the individual stakeholders is hugely important. But at the same time, how do we get away from talking to all 4,324 people in the organization one by one, which is certainly not what anybody's suggesting, but like that's the other end of the spectrum. So how do you balance and have a tailored, nuanced approach that communication needs, so that you can continue to make as much progress as you can, while at the same time keeping folks involved and aware. Thanks.
Right, kind of combining your stakeholder analysis and plan and communications plan. That's great. And Melvin, I'm going to tip it over to you to ask the last question, because I am looking at the time. And I want to remind folks, this is the first of many conversations about this. This is something we're very focused on. So we are interested in your suggestions as we move forward. Over to you.
I am almost rolling on the floor laughing about change management. And for those of us that have children, this. Kids have the best way of tailoring the message. I know what to ask mom for. I know what to ask dad for. And I'm persistent until I get what I want. And so if you want to learn about change, ask your children. They're the only ones that can get you to get something or buy something after you said no. And so in the last 5 minutes or so, I want to tee this up for you, Steve, and I want to give everybody a minute to respond. But in your closing comments, what other lessons can a group learn about continuous improvement and how that continuous improvement is measured and not seen as, rework? One of the things we talk about in Agile is there's a backlog. And so we're constantly working that backlog, constantly delivering stuff. It's the reason my wife uses her credit card. She calls it continuous improvement on what we're doing. So how does that work, and how do we measure that going forward?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky thing for IT professionals, and I think there's a little bit of a built-in tension where whenever we talk about strategic alignment in IT and the mission, the question then is IT on the hook to deliver mission performance? And I think it makes IT professionals uncomfortable. They're like, there's too many things I can't control. I can only control my IT environment. But I think the reality is we've got to own some of that. One of the great things about the IRS, and I think Harrison will probably agree with this, especially in the processing environment, the IRS measures everything that moves. It's crazy. But the good thing about it is when improvements happen, it because it's being measured. So as an example, early on, we were able to measure the difference between several elements of electronic filing and paper filing. These statistics are old because I haven't looked at them recently, but at least it'll give you a sense for the kinds of measures that you can use. And what you'll realize is it's a bit of a balanced scorecard. We knew, for example, that, and we know this continues to the point, refunds are processed much faster when you file electronically. If you get electronic deposit and file on paper. Back in the day, it was the difference between, getting your refund in a week and getting your refund in 6 weeks. There's probably better stats for that now. I know I e-filed over the weekend. My return was accepted and acknowledged like within an hour. It was crazy how fast it is. That doesn't happen on paper. We actually used data from the University of Michigan's Customer Service Satisfaction Index, and the customer satisfaction for e-filing traditionally has rivaled that what you could get at commercial online services of around 85% very satisfied or satisfied. And on paper, it is not nearly as good. So it was, cycle time, customer sat, and then we knew as well that the cost per transaction was dramatically lower for electronically filed returns versus paper. So it's important to look at, and none of those were IT measures, but IT enabled all of those things to happen. So figure out what the role of IT is in those mission measures, and then make sure that you have different kinds of both quantitative and qualitative measures. That would be my suggestion. No.
Great. 3 minutes left. Dan, Stu, want to give Beth and Harrison their final comments, final closings. So Beth, over to you.
No, just thank you for the opportunity. Obviously, this is a topic that is multifaceted. glad that you guys are going to be doing a series of these because obviously we can't cover all aspects of it in an hour. Appreciate everyone's time and participation, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Harrison, sir. Hey, Kool-Aid.
Hey, there's so many jokes I can make, but I'm going to let it be. Beth answered it great. Appreciate the time. Appreciate the comments, and appreciate the questions. Thanks, folks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Melvin, so nice to co-moderate with you. We haven't done it in a while, so thank you.
Always a
And
pleasure, Vera.
thanks. And back over to you, Dan and Stu.
Great, thank you. I'll get us started, but again, by thanking Vera and Melvin and all our panelists for the session today. Very informative. I know we had more questions that we could answer in the hour we had, so that's fantastic. I love the interaction. Stu, did you want to go over the last bit
Sure.
here?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. This is a real important note because next month we have a joint session with the emerging tech. If you guys remember, if some of you participated, we had a session in February on quantum. So we're extending that, and the session is going to be on April 19th, 11 to 12:30, an hour and a half. And we're going to talk about transitioning to the emerging tech to commodity tech, the ideation of and road mapping approach. So we're going to talk quantum, we're going to talk TBM, we're going to talk change management. And so as we're all rushing and sprinting to the cloud, we need to think about these things as well. So it'll be a pretty exciting session. We've been kind of planning this out, and we're working towards that.
I might add, if folks are interested in helping to lead those discussions around change management TBM, do reach out to Stu or I, and we can get you plugged into the speaking side of it.
Yeah. And then just to wrap up, we did have some really good things over the last few weeks. We participated, we had our Ellison and
Erica.
our, yeah, thank you, Laura. Participate in our Digital Transformation Summit, which we were able to really focus on getting that message out around our best practices. And then we do have some projects going forward. So that is it. Dan, do you want to close it out?
Absolutely. Thank you all again. And we hope to see you next month, April 19th. The days slightly changed, right, to do the joint session, but do join us for that longer session with the emerging tech team, or COI rather. Thank you very much and have a great March. Bye all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now. Bye now.